Sort out your own security. That's what the US is telling its allies as the Pentagon adopts a new national defence strategy. Washington is now focusing on the homeland and its interests in the Western Hemisphere. So what's behind this shift and what's the fallout for America's allies around the world? This is Inside Story. Hello again, I'm James Bays. A new Pentagon Defence Strategy has been announced. It's rooted in Donald Trump's America First approach, prioritising homeland security and influence in the Western Hemisphere. It expands on the national security strategy published by the White House last month and marks a clear departure from the US's post-Cold War policies. Washington's made it clear to allies it will only provide what it says is limited support, downplaying threats from countries like China and Russia. The new strategy comes as no surprise. Trump and his officials have been engaged in often heated debates with close allies about what role the United States is expected to play in their defence. We'll discuss what this shift means for the US posture on the world stage in a moment, but first this report from Imogen Kimber.
Moving forward, US defence strategy will be looking inwards to homeland security and the Western Hemisphere. That's according to the Pentagon's 2026 National Defence Strategy, a plan that comes out every 4 years. Border security is national security, the report says, and it will restore American military dominance in the Western Hemisphere. But what does the strategy mean for US foreign policy? China is still considered a threat, but a far milder one. The document says there should be respectful relations and China will be approached through strength, not confrontation. The Pentagon says the US will maintain a balance of power in the South Pacific and shows a strengthening of defences along the islands Taiwan, Japan and the Philippines. Russia is mentioned as a persistent but manageable threat to NATO's eastern members, a softening of its perceived threat level from previous reports. The report also says South Korea is capable of taking primary responsibility for deterring North Korea, with critical but more limited US support. And the US's European allies will also be given more limited support and, quote, will take the lead against threats that are less severe for us, but more so for them, considered a reference to NATO and the war in Ukraine. The report also underlines US plans to gain or maintain access in the Panama Canal, Gulf of Mexico and Greenland. Out with utopian idealism, in with hard-nosed realism, it says. Imogen Kimber, Al Jazeera for Inside Story.
Well, let's discuss this further. We have guests today around the world. In Washington, D.C., Adam Clements is US foreign policy analyst and a former Pentagon official. In Munich, Marina Miron is researcher with the Defence Studies Department at King's College in London. And in Seoul, Youngshik Bong, visiting professor at the Graduate School of International Studies at the Yonsei University and an advisor to South Korea's Ministry of National Defence. So here we have it. This is the National Defence Strategy of the United States, 2026. Let me start with you, Marina. Your main takeaway, what does this mean for US allies and US adversaries?
Good day, James. Excellent question, because there are a lot of things that this new national defense strategy could mean. Essentially, what it is signaling is a shift away from focusing on the European theater, and we're returning to what the Trump administration has been communicating. On the one hand, the dissatisfaction with the way the Europeans handle their defense spending. On the other hand, the US focus on the Western Hemisphere. And if we look parallel to that, to the national security strategy, to the new one, we also see that China and Russia ceased to be named as adversaries, as main adversaries. So we see a radical shift from what NATO has been perceiving as its main adversaries in this national defense strategy. In other words, European NATO members and also NATO allies are worried about the sudden shift and the vacuum that might be left by the United States, because we still have to remember that more than 50% of capabilities come from the United States, including logistics, air-to-air refueling, operational command, and so on. And these are capabilities that are not easily filled, even if the money is there.
Youngshik, I mean, we'll go into detail in this discussion, but one of the main points is the US is saying allies need to pull their weight more than they're doing in the past. And just one quote from the document: "A threat to a person halfway around the world is not the same as to an American." Well, in the past, there were all sorts of common values: liberty, democracy, and freedom. That language is not there anymore. Give us a taste, an early taste of, somewhere like South Korea, a key US ally, how people are feeling about this.
Well, in this tough international security, then you have to get basic things right. First and foremost, before you talk about high values as freedom and democracy and economic, cooperation, that is the principle of the transactional foreign policy and national security policy of the Trump administration in the second term. So countries in cooperation with the United States, like South Korea, whether they like it or not, has to make response to the new reality as manifested in the National Defense Strategy published by the Trump administration. So the saving grace for countries like South Korea is that it has elbow room between China and the United States. If Trump administration's priority is to make U.S. forces stationed in South Korea more like regional stabilizing forces, departing from its traditional mission to deal with the deterrence of North Korea with its conventional nuclear forces, then South Korea's strategic autonomy will be increased. So there is a room for creative and necessary adjustments demanded for countries like South Korea.
Adam, you have served in the military, but you've also, more importantly, I think, for this particular discussion, you've served as an official in the Pentagon, where this document is written. Now, you see here it says Department of War on the top of the document, although that's a little bit disputed because Congress still calls it the Department of Defence. Only it can legally, under a statute, change its name. Tell us who writes this document and how important is it? It comes out, I believe, every 4 years.
Thank you, James. I think the National Defense document, you could take it as some type of perspective or position that the Pentagon leadership is trying to state of what its military security objectives are. And it should, of course, be integrated with the National Security Strategy, which is a specific document that the White House takes the lead in publishing. Also, as well, and normally the Pentagon will also coordinate or discuss some of this strategy with its partner in foreign policy, the Department of State. But you do highlight some things that have changed in the past between administrations. There maybe weren't dramatic changes between the National Defense Strategy. And then the term that you've highlighted, burden sharing, or other countries trying to take on or being told to take on more share of their defense. I don't think this is new as you compare to the first Trump administration. And we heard that many times. I think that was a key statement, this burden sharing, quote unquote, as a talking point, both publicly in the media and also behind closed doors and diplomacy and specific talking points. So I think there's some things there that haven't changed from the first Trump administration. And then finally, I'll say as well that this is just a document. It's a paper. It's not prescriptive. I think it's just a guide of maybe how some in the Trump administration and the Pentagon are thinking. But ultimately, I think as we've seen over the course of the past year, that a lot of the U.S. foreign policy is based on the week of President Trump. And so it's still very difficult, I think, to pin down, especially on a piece of paper, exactly what's prescriptive of what would happen over the course of the next few years.
Adam, what about the language in the document? Because normally I would think this is supposed to be a clear-eyed strategy document, not political. And yet I'm reading it, and it's pretty political language, very effusive in its praise of President Trump. President Trump has rebuilt the American military. President Trump's historic and needed shift is to put American interests first. President Trump is leading our nation into a new golden age. Is this the sort of language you'd expect in a document like this?
James, I think you're right to point out of how the document has become, in this case, more politicized than what have been in the past. I think you're right to point out that the United States military, its core function is to support and defend the Constitution of the United States and U.S. interests, regardless, irrespective of who the president is in the White House. And so I think you're right to highlight some of those things in the political language. But look, I think, again, for the next administration, whatever comes after it, there'll be more changes. Every administration wants to try to put its political stamp on something, and I think that's what you've just highlighted in some of the specific language in this particular version of the National Defence Strategy.
Marina, the document is, as these things are, a document that looks at the whole global posture of the US military. But I think it's worth looking at what they say in the document are the top priorities. Number one, defend the US homeland. Number two, deter China in the Indo-Pacific. Number three, increase burden sharing with US allies and partners. That, I think, will worry some of those. And number four, supercharge the defence industrial base. Now, number one there, the US homeland, that was not number one. Last time there was one of these documents under Biden in 2022 that stressed that China, the People's Republic of China, remains our most consequential strategic competitor for coming decades. And back in 2018, Trump was in power then. But again, China and Russia were the central challenge to US security. There's a big change here.
That's a very good point, James. And I think I would briefly want to offer a slightly different angle when we're talking about the political nature of the national defense strategy. It is a roadmap. However, it is also political signaling to U.S. adversaries and allies, because countries like Russia, countries like China, North Korea, they read it and they formulate their own documents accordingly. Otherwise, this document wouldn't be public. So there is a purpose why it is public. And of course, we have now China as a competitor. That is a completely different terminology from China being an adversary, which means that the focus will be shifting away from competing, from trying to defeat China, to some sort of a healthy competition in the military domain in specific regions, the High North being one of them. And we have seen that with Greenland. It's interesting that Russia is not being mentioned specifically in the context of the war in Ukraine. And it seems like the Trump administration is trying to offload that problem to the Europeans. And again, burden sharing, it is all consistent with what we have seen coming from the White House since last January, when Donald Trump took office. He was stressing America first. So first, it's quite realistic in terms of international relations. Your national interest trumps everything else. And if it's not in your national interest, then you're not going to do XYZ, be supporting allies or whatever it is. And it is quite transactional in nature. And so what we're seeing here is essentially put in wording what the Trump administration has been saying so far. And this is, of course, a very strong signal to the Europeans. If we combine it with the rest of what we have heard from the White House, including at the World Economic Forum in Davos just a few days ago. So it all makes sense in the grand strategic picture of where the Trump administration is steering in terms of foreign and defense policy.
Youngshik, if we look at the language on China, the document says it believes that when President Trump took office, it was one of the most dangerous security environments in the US's history. But it says now, and it makes it pretty clear that conflict in China is a long way off, and they don't see that as a possibility. Our goal is not to dominate China, nor is it to strangle and humiliate them. And the focus seems to be on trade and economics.
But there is a contradiction in many different languages in the document that we all know that containing China was the main priority for the Trump administration in the second term, based upon what he said during the presidential campaign in 2024. And although the National Defense Strategy takes pains not to antagonize China, but it is what it is, that containing China's rise has been the main priority of global strategy of the United States since the Obama administration in its first term. And that priority has been inherited by the Donald Trump administration in the first term. And it continues to be the main focus of the global strategy of the United States. So although the report tried to tame the language about China's rise, that we want a decent peace on terms favorable to Americans, but that China can accept and live with. But the reality is that United States and China have been engaging in very serious and fierce strategic competition, and Trump administration tariff policies have been justified exactly so, based upon United States making itself strong enough to win the competition against China. So there is a contradiction in many different priorities set in the document.
Adam, I assume when a document like this drops, foreign ministries and defence ministries around the world are grabbing it, poring over it, searching keywords. What does it say about us? What does it say about our interests? And if you do search those keywords, you'll see Africa is mentioned twice, as is Japan. France, Germany and Mexico get one mention each. 0 mentions for the UK, Australia, India, surprisingly, given what happened in the last month, Venezuela, where the US deposed President Maduro just 3 weeks ago. And staying with China, are you not a bit surprised the word Taiwan doesn't come up in this document?
Well, James, first I'd like to highlight a point that Marina said about this being signaling a document that is used to signal to these other capitals are reading this document. I think that's plays into your answer, the answer to your question. If this is strategic signaling on behalf of the United States, the absence of saying Taiwan may be part of its toned down rhetoric, or the toned down word of saying some type of a balance of power, strategic competition, instead of saying China being an adversary. So I think you're right to point that out, and I'm sure it's not just China seeing this and reading this, the lack of saying Taiwan, but also Russia as well, watching very closely. But once again, I go back to what I said previously. I don't want to dismiss it as totally just a document that doesn't have any type of meaning at all. I'm just trying to say that sometimes maybe there's some that put too much stock as this as being very prescriptive of what U.S. defense policy would be in the coming years to the end of this Trump administration. So I just caution against that and take it for its face value of what it says. And then, as we found in the course of the past year, that a lot of what President Trump's and the Pentagon's defense strategy are, it changes very dramatically from a personal type of strategy versus some type of grand strategy, if you will.
Youngshik, on the Korean Peninsula, it says your country needs to play a bigger role in defending against North Korea. You've got, I believe, currently 28,500 US troops there serving in South Korea. Also, the document does not mention denuclearization of the Korean Peninsula. I mean, are there worries in South Korea that the US is perhaps going to reduce that number of troops and reduce the importance of this issue in terms of the US's outlook globally?
Well, you have to see the whole issues in balance because, yes, there is a concern for potential reduction and the relocation of U.S. forces currently stationed on the Korean Peninsula. But at the same time, any changes made on the strategic posture of U.S. forces in South Korea will open the gates for South Korean military to assume more responsibility. And as an extension of that change, assuming more authority. So it is getting closer for South Korea to obtain wartime operational control through the Combined Forces Command. So main focus of South Korean military will be deterring the ground forces of North Korea in case of any military emergency situation rising on the Korean Peninsula. And the main mission of the U.S. force in South Korea will be not deterring North Korea, but focusing the maintenance and peace and stability across the Taiwan Strait. So you get some and you lose some. You accept the reduction and change of the mission for U.S. forces stationed in your country, but at the same time, in compensation for those changes, South Korea may cultivate increase a role in determining its own national defense by assuming the leading role in the security alliance between South Korea and the United States by acquiring the wartime operational control and getting Trump administration's full support for South Korea's construction of nuclear power submarines.
Marina, we've heard from all of you that allies will be watching this very closely, but so will potential adversaries, as you said earlier on, China and Russia. Well, we've had some Russian reaction from Dmitry Peskov, who is the press secretary to Vladimir Putin. Have a listen, Marina, to what he said. He was typically forthright.
Trump's methods don't fully correspond to our approach of a multipolar world. Trump likes to act, as he says, through strength. It's what we here in Russia would call bending others over. Those who allow themselves to be bent over will continue being bent over. And it's important we don't allow it to be done to us.
Marina, what do you make of that? He doesn't seem to be welcoming this new strategy particularly there. But do you think in Moscow they won't be unhappy?
Well, it is an interesting one because we have to differentiate what the official rhetoric is coming from a Kremlin spokesman, which is different from what the establishment actually thinks and how it is going to act once it has studied the new national defense strategy. And the general mood within the Kremlin, what has been reflected in military publications and so on, despite what we're seeing in Western media talking about the rapprochement between Russia and the United States. In Russia, there is a lot of skepticism towards the intentions of Donald Trump. So they're trying to be very careful not to upset the Trump administration, but at the same time, there is still preparedness for the worst case scenario. And I think this is a policy that the Russians will be continuing to keep, along with working with the allies, because what the Russians and the Chinese essentially are advocating for when we look at the BRICS forum, they want a multipolar world without the US leadership. A lot of the media says the US is in decline, the global hegemon is no more. But at the same time, there is a realization that the United States still retains a lot of military potential, and therefore these countries shouldn't just simply assume, because the Trump administration's foreign policy is diametrically opposed to what we've seen under the Biden administration, that it will be their friend.
Adam, number one priority, protecting the homeland and the Western Hemisphere in this document. It is interesting that the earlier document that came from the White House, the National Security Strategy, last month, didn't even mention Greenland, which has been the focus of so much attention over the last couple of weeks. This document does. It says Greenland is a key terrain. It also mentions the Panama Canal and the Gulf of America, Gulf of Mexico to most people in most atlases. So, I mean, do you think, for example, I assume to come up with a document like this, there's been a lot of drafting over many, many weeks. Do you think Greenland was even in there a few weeks ago?
Well, James, I think what you're highlighting is at the time when it was written, of course, the Pentagon trying to address some key choke points, some key points of terrain, of geography around the world that it sees as important to U.S. national defense. And so I think there may be a point here of what you're saying here of a difference, or at least trying to understand strategically what Greenland has always been or has been developing over the past several years as far as key terrain in the Arctic, of passageways of shipborne transit when the ice is melted, or from a nuclear deterrence standpoint. It's been key terrain. The U.S. has been able to had free reign to station military troops there for a long time. So I think there's an important point here to differentiate between the political rhetoric and some of the reasoning, justification, and some of the political circus we've seen in the past couple of weeks, as opposed to strategic terrain that's been strategic terrain based on geography for many, many years.
Marina, let me bring in Marina on that, because you heard Adam talk about the political circus, but the political circus is what runs things at the moment. That is the Trump way. And I'd like to guess maybe that Donald Trump hasn't actually read this document at all. I suspect if you were to question him on the detail, he doesn't know the detail of the document that's here. And given the unpredictable nature of Donald Trump, what is this strategy really worth?
The interesting part here is you, James, mentioning political circus and the changing opinions which we see from the Trump administration or from the president himself. And we should ask ourselves why. What is exactly happening? Why do we see Venezuela on one day and then Colombia gets threatened, then Mexico, then Greenland, then we see Iran? So what is behind this political theater? What is the underlying purpose? And I think that is a question that we should be asking. Is there a clear outline of grand strategy within the Trump administration? Is this just a smoke
Marina,
screen?
that is the question we are going to leave with the viewers today. Thanks to all of our guests, Adam, Clements, Marina, Miron and Youngshik, Bong. If you missed any of the programme, you can watch it again on demand at our website, aljazeera.com. Where shall we shine the inside story spotlight next time? Your ideas and suggestions are welcome. Go to our Facebook page. That's facebook.com/AJ Inside Story, or post your thoughts on X, where you'll find us at AJ Inside Story. We're here at the same time every day. Until next time, from me, James Bays, and all the team, stay safe. Bye-bye for now.